Operational procedures, it's just a catch-all of recommendations and common sense things that you need to think about in terms of how you operate, and maybe operate differently than you operated 20 or 30 years ago. Team approach to children's and youth ministries. It's very important. I mean, in our abuse prevention guidelines, we talk about it's better to have 2 unrelated adults in supervision at all times. That's the best scenario. Unrelated because if you're related to somebody, say husband and wife, although it makes sense to teach that way, the problem is if there's an allegation, your spouse's witness, their witness in your behalf, is generally discounted by courts. So again, it makes it harder to defend yourself. But alternatively to 2 adult rules, we also talk about if there's only 1 adult in the room, leaving the door open and having a monitor circulating regularly through the classroom areas every 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, and having this as your procedure. Okay. The problem is with smaller churches, you've got a classroom of 2 or 3 children. What are you going to do, staff it with 2 adults? I mean, you won't have anybody in service, basically. So. Talking about volunteers under age 18 assisting under qualified adult supervision is a possibility. Remember, when you're off-premises activities, your abuse prevention procedures should still apply. Not just on your premises, but off your premises. 2 adult rule, screened individuals. Okay. I don't know if this is obvious to people, but corporal punishment is not okay in a church or Christian charity. Regardless of what your feelings are as a parent, it's not okay within this context. Again, we talked about it earlier in terms of ethnic or generational differences, but identifying permissible and unacceptable forms of touching, disciplining. And on the issue of child neglect, we've seen some cases where there's been problems in nurseries, in terms of health issues, changing diapers. And one thing that's a real issue now, especially in larger churches, is documenting receiving and releasing of children. Kidnapping issues, child custody issues. Who are you giving the child back to? Do they have the right to have that child? And I'll give you another example too. I'll give you 2 examples, in fact. I'll say this. We had a case in one of the churches where I think the mother dropped a child off. It was a toddler, maybe 2 years old. And the parents sent an older sibling, I think it was a sister, to get her from the nursery. I think the older sister was 7 or 8 years old. The nursery staff released the child to the older sibling. Oh yeah, I know them, that's the sister, they can go. Headed down the hallway and down the stairs. On the way down the stairs, she fell. And the toddler sustained serious and permanent brain damage. Now, the parents sent the sibling, but guess who got the lawsuit? See, the thing about it is, you have to have your standards, and we talked about this a little bit earlier about sending 17-year-old males out with a van load of other teenagers. It's the same issue here. Parents may have certain standards, but you have to have your minimum standards. You want to put your child into this program? Here's the rules. We don't care what your standards are, these are our standards. If you don't like those standards, that's fine. Don't use this free service that we're providing you, right? Really, that's what it comes down to. It's daycare, right? Yeah. The other example is a personal example, and I have to be so careful about what I say. When we had our first child, my son, we were visiting a church, a pretty large church, and my wife is not good with separation with kids, and I think that's pretty common. Mothers, have trouble with, making that separation. And I'm a proud dad, and I'm going to say, okay, I'll do it. I can do this. And I was really being very good about it. I went in. We hadn't been to this church before. I introduced myself. I made sure the staff knew who I was, who my son was, Matthew. He was like about 2.5 years old or 2 years old at the time. And it was one room with one door, a lot of kids, maybe 2 staff members. I think hopefully my memory is right, but I would say 25 kids in this age group. Okay, now I should have probably known better, but I was being careful. I was trying to be careful, and because the thing is, I don't want to lose the first one, right? That would be bad. So I'm taking this job really seriously. So I must have waited for 5 or 10 minutes, and our son is really good that way. He doesn't cry. He's a watcher. He kind of like takes everything in, and you know, he doesn't cry. He doesn't look for. He handles the situation, right? And so I left the room, walked down the hallway, go to walk upstairs. I just didn't have a good feeling, and I'm hardly a person to be accused of having a good intuition, but I didn't go up the stairs. I waited, because I didn't have a good feeling. Probably about 5 minutes later, the door opens. Matthew comes walking out. The door closes. He's looking down the other way, looking down different halls, looks finally around at me, sees me, didn't run to me or anything, he just walks down and walks towards me. I must have waited there for 10, 15 minutes, no door opening. Nothing. So you know what? Chances are somebody's going to find him, return him to the parents, whatever. But what are the other chances of happening too? Right? Especially in a larger church. Okay, so you really have to think about these things. I didn't tell my wife right away either. I kind of broke it to her gently, but it was a good ending. So. Some other obvious things to avoid being put in a position where you're causing abuse of some form or mental anguish, or inciting behavior, or imposing on people's confidentiality and privacy are photograph issues, consent for photograph of children. You know, maybe a long-angle group shot's okay, but starting to talk about individual photography appearing in bulletins and especially on websites and identifying people, not okay. Not okay. Unsupervised internet access. There was a drop-in center, Christian drop-in center. They thought, this is great, kids can come in and get internet access. Well, you know what? They eventually discovered the kids are all on porn sites. But this is a Christian ministry, and nobody was minding the shop. Okay? Think about how the parents felt about that when they found out. Right? We talked about operational procedures being ministry covenants signed by workers, volunteers, so that they understand as well. They've read and understand your prevention plan, because they're really upholding it for you. If they don't understand it, then how is it going to be upheld? It's just a piece of paper. Keeping documentation on file indefinitely for volunteer workers and employees, because again, like I said, these abuse cases, statute of limitations are routinely waived. You may not know if there's abuse being committed. I mean, hopefully you do. If you've got good screening procedures in place, the hope is this thing's going to come to light earlier than later. But it is possible that you may not find this out till 10, 20, 30 years from now. Also had an interesting case that went the other way. We had a church, and it floored me, but this church, there was an allegation that came up from 25 or 30 years ago. It was before they were insured with us, so we did talk to them about it. We tried to coach them and everything else. Turns out they kept all their records. Now, how many churches do that? They had who the teachers were, Sunday school attendance, week by week, what the dates were. Well, it turns out in this allegation that the person, it was true, this person attended the church. They were never a Sunday school teacher. Of course, nobody remembered whether they were or not. They sort of remembered him, but they didn't know if he was a Sunday school teacher. He wasn't even there during the time period when these allegations happened. And they actually used this successfully to defend themselves in litigation. Think about that. Again, we talked earlier about the issue of parental consent, especially for off-premises activities, field trips, anything higher risk. Qualified supervision in public places. I'm aware of abuse having been committed against children in the care of a church in a public park. And there hasn't been litigation related to it, however there could be. And it had nothing to do with abuse by the supervisors of the church. It had, the only question that potentially that might be brought up in a court case is, did you have enough people overseeing the kids in the park during your summer camping program? the person who committed it was charged and convicted, or charged at least, I don't know if they've been convicted yet, but good case in point where the parents may decide, hey, we're going to take action against the church because they obviously weren't paying attention to what was going on. They didn't have enough supervision. And it is really important that when something happens, doesn't matter whether it's an abuse incident or even just an injury, do have reports filled out, incident reports, right away. In Plan to Protect, I know there are some sample forms, so it guides you and helps you to know what to put down. There is a reason, though, why we suggest have it filled out right away and have it filled out by the person or people that are closest to the issue. There is this idea in courts that the longer the distance between the event and the recall, the writing of it, the less reliable, because people's minds naturally be colored by things that are said after the fact, and the recall becomes less and less. There's almost like a half-life to it, and in the insurance adjusting world, it's kind of like you look at this fresh document that was done a day or two after the event, and they love that. That's great. But they see something that appears to have been written 2 months after the fact by somebody who really had nothing to do with it, and it's like, throw that out, right? So it's important to document it as soon as you know about it.